It is my honor to introduce our keynote speaker, Vivek Kundra, who was the first ever CIO of the United States until just a month ago. Vivek was part of the Obama White House charged with overhauling the government's use of technology and streamlining its massive IT infrastructure. In just 2.5 years on the job, hard to believe, he is credited with saving over $3 billion, adopting game-changing technologies, strengthening cybersecurity of the nation, and very important to us journalists in the room, launching an open government data.gov platform, which has been replicated around the world, which is just fantastic work. Before going to the White House, Vivek was CTO of the District of Columbia, and before that, a similar position with the state of Virginia. And while Vivek is contemplating all of his future game-changing, world-changing endeavors, he's here in Boston, or in Cambridge rather, at Harvard, splitting his time between Shorenstein and Berkman, focusing on the implications of cloud computing in institutions, and I believe that is the subject he's going to be talking about today. Interviewing Vivek is Tom Ashbrook, journalist and host of WBUR's award-winning show On Point. And the best way for me to give you a sense of Tom's impact is through a personal anecdote, if you will indulge me. For years now, my teenage son, he's now a teenager, would have to go to sleep with the radio on because the sound of talking soothed him and it allowed us to not have to sit at his bedside for hours and hours in the evening. So of course, to listen to talking, that meant he was listening to public radio. And in Washington, D.C., where I live, Tom's show On Point runs on WAMU at 9 o'clock, which is my son's bedtime. So Tom Ashbrook was his lullaby. And about, I guess, 3 years ago, when I was about to be named CEO of NPR, I sat down with my kids. I said, well, I'm leaving the New York Times, and I'm going to have a job, and I'm going to be running NPR. And my son went, oh, are you going to meet Tom Ashbrook? So that gives you a little sense of Tom's impact on the world. So Tom and Vivek, welcome.
Great. Are we on? Hello, hello? Okay, it's Lullaby on Broadway today. No sleepy time here. It's great to be here. Good morning, everybody. I'm feeling very, I know it's virtual and digital, but I'm feeling very analog and physical and like here in this morning. So, good morning. Good morning. All right. Vivek, it's wonderful to be here with you.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
And Vivian, it's great to be here with you. I love the way we surf here, we surf there, and it all folds back in together, and it's great to be here with you this morning. I hope your son is sleeping well. Vivek Kundra is just incredible. If you followed the news about this guy, he has in the last couple of years been named CIO of the Year by just about every organization that cares in the country. He was born in New Delhi, grew up in Tanzania. This had the happy effect on his life of preparing him very well for government speak and computer manuals. His first language is Swahili. It's a joke. And just to get us sort of out in the world and understanding, I mean, we're talking about the digital future of this country today, but the world is a rich and wonderful and abundant place, and it's so great to live in a global time when someone born in New Delhi and raised in Tanzania is the first CIO of the United States of America. Give us a little Swahili welcome, would you, my friend Vivek?
Jambo, habari gani one?
Jambo, habari gani one? Good. We like it. All right, first CIO, Chief Intelligence Officer of the United States of America.
Information.
Excuse me, information, of course. What am I doing? Now, but I wanted to ask you on that front, we've recently seen the unveiling of the Martin Luther King Memorial, and upcoming is a new Dwight Eisenhower Memorial, and I just wonder, where do you think the Chief Information Officer Memorial will be to you one day when it's finally unveiled on the National Mall? And what would you like to look like?
There are no memorials on that side of the world, but I think a big part of what's happening as far as the digital world is concerned, it's an issue that we're going to be discussing. As you think about the physical world, what does it really mean in terms of continuity of history? when more and more content is actually digital born. I think that's one of the things that we're grappling with, and I remember with the National Archives, one of the big struggles is to figure out how do you actually catalog all that history for centuries to come.
Things that can be born digitally can die digitally and die relatively easily
Absolutely.
digitally.
Absolutely.
You know, there's a lot we're going to talk about here, but because this is a hall full of journalists, and I know how impatient journalists are, and I hope that digital journalists are even more impatient given the news cycle of a flea that we're all working on now. I wish you'd take us to the bottom line. You've been working to bring the federal government into the digital age. There's a lot more to be done on that. But there's many ramifications of that. We'll talk about a number of them today. But for the news and for journalists, when you picture where this should and could go, will go ultimately, what do you think the move into a more effectively and fully digitized federal government operation will mean for news and journalism, and thereby the public understanding through the news of their own government?
Well, I think a lot of it is actually not different in terms of the work that I did when I was at the White House. In a lot of ways, I thought of myself almost as a digital journalist, in the sense that I believed, as you look at the foundation of our democracy, a more open, transparent, and participatory government is what we really want to aspire to and build. And I spent a lot of time using the very tools that have empowered, whether it's businesses to fundamentally drive efficiencies within their own ecosystems, or it's people and the ability to connect, very much try to figure out how do we make sure that as we're thinking about government, we recognize two principles. Number one, there's a fundamental change in technology, and a big part of it is going to be driven by the Darwinian pressures. And number two, we need to recognize that we don't have a monopoly on the best ideas. So based on those principles, a lot of the investments we made were very much about making sure that journalists and the American people actually had the information they needed to tell the story of what was going on with their government.
Do you think that digital government is inherently, of necessity, we know the cliches about how the digital world is more open, but is it inherently more open and transparent?
Absolutely not, because it can be used in a lot of other ways, which is to actually close and limit access and make sure that a few powerful actors have asymmetrical access to information. Just because it's digital doesn't mean that it's inherently open and transparent.
Important note right there. Later in this hour, in about 30 minutes, I'm going to invite questions from the audience. So as we go, please be thinking about that, and you'll be welcome to put them directly to Vivek Kundra. When Barack Obama arrived at the White House, and this was just shortly before he brought you in, he was famously shocked at the state of technology there. Washington Post wrote early on, if the Obama campaign represented a sleek new iPhone kind of future, the first day of the Obama administration looked more like the rotary dial past. Sounds like a Mitt Romney commercial, but what did you find when you came in here? The state, I mean, here's a huge consumer of everything digital and computer, $80 billion annual budget in computer digital technology, biggest consumer in the world. What's the state of the digital reality that you found when you came in as CIO of the federal government?
Well, I'll never forget my first day on the job. What happened was I was handed a huge stack of PDF documents, and my team
that
said,
had been printed out.
Right, that was printed out and stapled.
Yikes.
And they said, congratulations, you're now responsible for overseeing $80 billion in IT spending. And here's a stack of $27 billion worth of IT projects that are millions of dollars over budget and, frankly, years behind schedule. And the second thing that happened was I found out that my team was assigned BlackBerries based on the number of years they had served in the government or the square footage of their office.
The older, the better.
Yeah, and if you remember, even the president had to fight tooth and nail to get a BlackBerry.
You wrote, my neighbor's 10-year-old could look up the latest stats of his favorite baseball player on his phone, on the school bus, but I couldn't get an update on how we were spending billions of taxpayer dollars, $80 billion, while at my desk at the White House. So, you looked out on this, you were given this great title, What was your strategy? What is the vision that you brought of what you hoped to do with the federal government's digital presence?
Well, the first thing I recognized was that no amount of resources within my office were actually going to be able to solve this problem alone. So I looked outwards in terms of other models where you had huge efficiencies and transparency. And the model I looked at was the stock market. What's really interesting about the stock market is that you have transparency in terms of what's happening as far as the price of a stock.
At each nanosecond.
At each nanosecond, you can buy, sell, or hold, make decisions. And the simple question I asked myself is, well, why can't we apply that to billions of dollars in federal IT spending? And I recall testifying in front of Senator Carper, and he asked me the very question you asked me, and I said, well, Senator, what I'm going to do is launch an IT dashboard, and I'm literally going to put every major IT project online with the picture of every CIO in the United States government that's responsible for that project and how it's performing. So within a 60-day period, I launched the IT dashboard. We got the president to take a picture of him looking at the IT dashboard, and I blogged about it. And within minutes of doing that, I got so many phone calls from CIOs across the federal government, from the Department of Energy to Health and Human Services, who said, oh my God, for the first time, my cabinet secretary called me and asked me why a project is red. And that was the power of transparency, where literally shining light on the operations of government ended up having a huge impact on how we were spending taxpayer dollars. A department, Veterans Administration, actually halted 42 IT projects, terminating a number of them, and we're able to save $3 billion as a result of shining a light on the operations of the federal government.
Everybody who's touched one knows that a dashboard can be great or it can be clumsy. It can take you deep or it can take you almost nowhere in an organization. It requires good programming and a lot of cooperation. At this point, after you spent your 2.5 years, what can we do with the federal dashboard? What can people inside government do? What can people outside government do? How much? What percentage of what goes on with our government can we see there, and like what?
Well, I think this is where ONA can play a big role. One of the things I recognized after having launched the IT dashboard and the data.gov platform was that journalists weren't really using those resources to tell the stories of what's really going on within the government. I think what can happen in a big way is actually making sure that you're also building an ecosystem of users to be able to take that data. On the dashboard today, you could literally go online and download the raw data of how every major IT project is performing. On data.gov, there are over 400,000 data sets on every aspect of government operations, from healthcare to education to what's going on with the environment. And what I haven't seen is a huge pickup in the number of stories that are being told in a digital way using that raw data that's been made available publicly.
We're sitting in this hall with the cream of the crop of the digital journalism world. How many people in this hall are in organizations that use data.gov to explore what the federal government is doing? Hands up. Yeah, there's some, but it could be a lot more.
Absolutely, and I remember also when I was in DC government, one of the things that we did there was I literally took from an IT perspective, the operations of whether it was a police department, the public school system, and what we were doing in our office, and put all this information out there in terms of homicides, in terms of garbage collection and the time it was taking, in terms of permits that were being issued or school performance, and also contracts that were being awarded within the technology department. So you could literally see the government official who awarded the contract, the contract company that won it, and how much the government was paying them on an hourly rate. We saw immediately huge disparities in terms of who was getting paid how much. On the permitting side, we were able to detect all these disparities in terms of preferential treatment and so forth. So it also serves as a mechanism of fighting corruption as people use that data. There are a number of really interesting use cases that came out of that open data movement.
That was in the District of Columbia. We've got a prize winner at the conference here this week off of the homicide numbers there. District Columbia, this big. Federal government, this big. Give us sort of your best examples of where you think the richest opportunities are right now available at data.gov. What sectors, what silos, what fields, what data is out there that you most recommend people here paying attention to?
Well, I think it's available in every aspect of government operations, and the principle that I mentioned, that the government doesn't have a monopoly on the best ideas, through that, what I really mean is that I have no idea what value you'll be able to create, or the stories that will be able to be told at the intersection of multiple data sets. So it's not like you can take data, let's say, on the environment or in healthcare, but the real value is going to be to bring those two data sets and recognizing that there's real value there that's going to be created and stories that can be told.
Will people have to go out and build their own apps to dig into that, or is it really in a usable form at data.gov? I mean, the government is so vast. It's so much data. Is it usable, these kind of comparisons? And are there tools there to go in and unfold it?
Well, so there are plenty of tools there to actually take that data and use it and slice and dice and cube it. But there's a decision that I had made when I initially launched it, which was a question of how did we really want to launch the platform? We could either have built really nice looking applications and said this is what the government believes the truth is, or we could have said, well, we'll make all this information available in its raw format, and the American people can decide how that information can be used. So I went with a latter approach. And as a result of that, what we've seen is not just journalists who are, you saw a handful of people using that platform, but also entrepreneurs who are creating applications that they're selling. An example is somebody took a data set from the Consumer Product Safety Commission, which shows you every product that's been recalled and has real-time results of injuries at hospitals. And they built an iPhone app that allows you to literally go in. So if you're an expectant mother, you can go in before you buy a crib and see whether it's been recalled or not by scanning it, by scanning the barcode.
Scan the barcode and you'll get the federal government data on
whether the
incidents with that crib.
Exactly.
On your way to the surgery room, you can see this hospital's record on the surgery you're about to have?
Yeah, you can see the performance of that hospital in terms of patient ratings. You can see how the surgeries are rated in terms of outcomes and so forth. So vast amount of the data that's out there. And I believe it's an unexplored field in terms of journalism. And one of my biggest issues when I look at sort of stories today is that why do they have to be a point in time only? There are a number of stories that I believe are evergreen.
Especially if they're digital, so the numbers can just keep up with the reality
exactly.
as it goes.
Think about schools.
That's
every
a great
September,
idea.
People go to school. I would love to know how schools are performing in my zip code, in my neighborhood.
So
why can't they be persistent?
If you structure a story correctly for this, you could have kind of an evergreen story that was kind of a never-ending monitor of a particular issue.
Absolutely, and then bring in the narrative. So there's always two sides to the story, right? There's the qualitative and then there's a quantitative. So you could refresh the narrative every so often, but from a quant perspective, if that data is already there and governments are making it available, why not start building stories that live forever?
I don't know if you've paid enough attention to answer this. In your interactions with journalists, do their organizations appear to have the capacity to dissect and use and delve into this data effectively? Not the inclination, you're already saying we could do more, but the capacity.
Well, I think there's sort of a battle for the soul of the future of journalism right now in terms of what these technologies that are sort of game changers and the Darwinian pressure that they're bringing to the market. So you actually see some organizations that are doing an amazing job in terms of innovating and building that capacity, where others ignore this at their peril in terms of a fad that's going to disappear. And the question really is, do you want to be Amazon.com or do you want to be Barnes & Noble?
In the jungle, the data miners will win.
Absolutely.
Again, I don't know who better to ask. When you look at all the data that's available in the federal government, we've been reading a lot lately, Dana Priest and others writing about all the top secret data that's out there. Set that aside for a moment, top secret over here, but for all the putatively public data. How much is in data.gov? Is half of it there? Is it all there? 10%?
Well, I think it's, I can't place a percentage on it, but what I can tell you is that with 400,000 data sets that are there, it's just the beginning, right? Because there should be millions and millions of data sets. And if you look at what's happening throughout our world today, every aspect of whether it's our infrastructure or even our lives to some extent is being instrumented. So think about the transportation grid. There's sensors everywhere that are telling you how trains are running, buses are running, what time they're coming. If you look at our healthcare system to drive efficiency, more and more sensors are being deployed. And what this means is that big data becomes a huge problem as far as not just the storage and the ability to slice and dice and cube it, but also to separate noise from signal. And I think in terms of journalism, it'd be really interesting to see how stories are told by slicing and dicing that big data, taking data, turning it into information, information into insight, and that insight into stories that can be persistent.
I want to come back to format. It's a really important issue, but on this big data and all the sensors that are being laid out there in all corners of the world today, just a basic philosophical question. Part of what we have historically understood as freedom is based on ignorance. We didn't know a lot of things that were going on, and a lot of people didn't know those things about us. Do you think Americans are going to adopt all this information, the kind of nonstop monitoring of everything, and through journalists, I hope, the exploration of it, or will they push back? That's Big Brother. That's the face of Big Brother, monitoring every little thing we do and then shoving it in our face.
Well, I think they should push back, and here's why. I think it's absolutely wrong if people don't know what's happening with their information, and that they sign up with an agreement and it changes within minutes of signing up for that. I'm a big believer that we need to shift power to individuals, because what you're seeing is also a difference in terms of how generations perceive what is acceptable versus what is not acceptable. So if you talk to people who are born digital, so to speak, they're very comfortable with sharing information that you may not be on Facebook or on other platforms. But at the same time, what we need to do is we need to make sure that we're protecting individuals and their ability to make choices around how their information is actually being used at a personal level.
But how does that work when it's the government that we're talking about? With a private corporate company, I'm very accustomed to having checkboxes where I tell them in no uncertain terms, unless I'm being played, and I'm often being played. But I like to think I'm telling them, look, you can know this, this, this about me. You can use this, this, and this about me. But when it's the government, we have many experiences where they come and they just demand, tell us this, tell us that. We want this information. And we're not accustomed to telling them what they can do with that information. What about that balance of power, the individual and the government's power to use information kind of as it pleases?
Well, I think, look, that is definitely the issue of our time right now in terms of privacy and protections. But at the same time, if you look at the government, one of the reasons, by the way, it's so inefficient in terms of information and service, a lot of people ask, well, why can't the United States government be much more like an Amazon in terms of, which books I like, which services I need? One of the reasons is because there are statutes in place today that actually prevent the sharing of the information we're talking about. So there are a number of laws already on the books, whether it's with healthcare data or with tax data. So for example, the IRS can't really share data with other agencies. Is
that being effectively translated to the digital realm?
Well, it's because it can't share with other agencies. What ends up happening is when you deal with your government online, it's not as good an experience as
because it's
you
sort
would
of
have.
bound up with these regulations.
Exactly. But there's nothing wrong with that, right? I think from the very beginning, from the founding of this nation, we've always had a healthy mistrust of a strong central government. And I think in the digital world, that becomes even more true.
You spoke about big data, and that sits there as a gigantic challenge for everybody, including journalists, how to use that most effectively. Let's talk for a minute about big iron and the old big digital infrastructure of the federal government, and your push to take that to the cloud, and to take no small part of that to the commercially operated cloud, whether it's Amazon or Google or you name it. Let's just start first with your vision of that move. Why move from big old iron to the cloud, and how do you envision that move going?
So let me start with giving you a data point on the state of government when we first came in. Over the course of the last decade, the United States government went from 432 data centers to over 2,000 data centers in about 10 years. The average utilization of servers in terms of CPU cycles was under 27%. The average utilization of storage was under 40%. And we were
every agency wanted their own,
right,
but they weren't really using it to capacity.
Between agencies, bureaus would have their own.
Bureaus.
And then what ended up happening is you basically look at this and you ask yourself, well, how much are we really spending on infrastructure? Turns out we spend $24 billion every year on IT infrastructure. And I looked at what was happening with the most sort of leading edge companies and startups around the country. And all of the startups were actually moving towards cloud. So if you went to your board of directors or a venture capitalist and said, hey, I need $5 million and 6 months to hire systems administrators to run my email, to build my website, I need to install my own ERP system, and I need to make sure that I've got an army of people who are integrating all the systems, you get laughed out of the room. Right, because technology has left.
1985.
Right, and what happened is historically, if you think about it, is that in the 1960s, the greatest innovation in technology were happening in government. In the 1980s, that innovation moved to the enterprise. And in 2005, something big happened. All the innovation shifted to the consumer side. And that is one of the reasons I instituted a cloud-first policy, because the US government could save billions of dollars by moving away from building these redundant, duplicative systems and this infrastructure that was costing taxpayer billions of dollars. Just to give you a data point on some of the results, on something as simple as email, USDA and GSA were able to save $40 million by moving to the cloud.
So the word comes down, the big memo from the CIO of the federal government, cloud first. What does that mean?
What that means is that every agency in the US government has to evaluate cloud computing before they award any contract.
As an alternative, as an option. I mean,
well, as a mandate, because we would zero those out in the budget.
But what does it mean to consider it? Can they just say, we considered it, we don't want it, blow by it, no thanks?
Well, but then they would have to come sit down with me at the budget meetings, and we would start zeroing them out.
Oh, that's a cudgel. What did cloud first mean? Did it mean you will go to Amazon for your cloud provider, services provider? You'll go to Google. What are
well,
those
it didn't
terms?
mean that you would pick one vendor or the other.
Did it mean private vendors, though?
Well, it meant that you would consider based on your security requirements. So if you're in the national security space, you had data that had to be in government-owned, government-operated systems, that there would be a government-run cloud. So DoD has a government-run cloud. So instead of having various agencies going out there and building their own. But if you're, for example, looking at collaboration technologies, there's no need to go out there and build a government-owned, operated solution. There are a number of third parties in the private side that were doing a much better job.
When did you issue the cloud first mandate?
This started actually in September of 2009, and I still remember this is at the NASA Ames Research Center is where we started.
Here we are in September 2011. What portion of the federal government has moved to the cloud?
Well, every agency has moved about 3 systems. They're moving to the cloud itself. So I mentioned USDA, GSA. I actually put out a report of the state of public sector cloud computing, and you can look online if you go to cio.gov which systems were moved by agencies.
New York Times headline last month, federal push for cloud technology faces skepticism. They're talking about pushback. So my question again, what portion has actually gone to the cloud of what you think in a perfect world, would be there?
Well, I identified about $20 billion that could move roughly to the cloud. I'd have to check what the latest data is. But of course there's pushback, because you have the old guard that wants to preserve the current status.
Who is that? You've talked about the IT cartel. So is it actually the government that pushes back, or is the old guard the vendors of big iron who are used to making billions off the federal government and don't want them to scamper up to the cloud?
I think it's both, right? You have government folks who are afraid of change, and they've held on to these beliefs because they grew up in an IT environment where it was all about owning, managing, running your own systems. And you've got a set of vendors, frankly. The way they make money is through a land and expand strategy, which is that they start off by putting a consultant on board, and the consultant's job is to go out there and multiply as many consultants as possible in their client to make sure that they're billing at hundreds of dollars an hour. And guess what happens? The government gets IT projects like the one at the Department of Defense. After 10 years and $850 million in taxpayer money, we had to kill it because it didn't work.
Did they push you out of the White House for saying that?
No, I said it while I was in the White House.
State Department Chief Information Officer, your counterpart there, Susan Stewart. How can we ensure that the monitoring of the commercial cloud environment is done well as we believe it can be done internally? Where will the data reside? When we're managing it on our data centers, we have the answer to these questions. What about the security for agencies, for citizens of the commercial cloud?
So one of the things that I've talked about at length, and I've proposed that at the World Economic Forum in January, that we get together governments to actually talk about the data sovereignty issues, which is a real issue. And what I mean by data sovereignty is that if you're a government agency, you have to figure out where that data resides within, whether it's in the continental United States or globally. But a bigger problem that I see in terms of the future of commerce is that if every country in the world starts saying that the data must only reside in our country, all of a sudden it's going to have a chilling effect on commerce. Also, we've got to recognize that the US government isn't just in the United States. The State Department is all over the world. The Department of Defense is all over the world.
I wasn't even thinking so much about sovereign borders as just commercial public borders and private information. By the way, 5 minutes and we'll take your questions. So if you've got them, begin to. Are there microphones somewhere, or do people just sing out? Microphones will be ready for you. So if you want to get to a microphone with a question, feel free to do it now. They're out here somewhere. I was talking with David Stock and Michael Fitzgerald about this move to the cloud, and some of the issues that come up around, let's say for journalists, Freedom of Information Act. Now, if the data, it's public data, but it's on the Google cloud or the Amazon cloud, does a FOIA request still apply in the same way?
Absolutely.
Google's obligated to dish it out just as if it were on a government?
It's the government agencies. If you think about it, today, already there are over 4,700 systems that are not in the hands of the federal government. They've been basically being run by private contractors. If you look at our voice systems right now, 70% of the telco infrastructure that the US government uses, that's being run by Verizon and AT&T. So it's actually not that different. I think this comes down to the point where folks who want to prevent this move to the cloud, because it has the ability to save the government billions of dollars and disrupt the current business models, will raise this point. But the reality is the government is already engaged in those types of contracts.
When does it ever come back to the government? I'm looking here at a Zynga, absolutely private. They go to the scalable commercial cloud, for the sort of elastic part of what they do. But when it gets really serious, they bring it home to their Z cloud infrastructure. Zynga wants it on its own cloud. Can the government have everything out there on Amazon and Google, or most, or does it have to bring it home to its own version without going all the way to what's the DoD's version, mission-oriented, resilient clouds?
Well, I think it's going to depend system by system, right? And you're going to have to weigh what are the consequences of the data that the government has on those systems. So in the case of national security, you would make a decision that it would have to be in a government-owned operated cloud. In a case where you actually have a lot of sensitive data, you may do a hybrid approach. But if you look at something something as simple as the example I used around email and so forth, it absolutely makes no sense.
What's more vulnerable to hacking, domestic or otherwise, the cloud or big iron?
I think it's both of them, depending on the talent that's actually running those systems. So the argument that I've made is, in many cases, the government would be better off by moving to some of these commercial providers because it can't compete for the talent when it comes to security.
You'll know this much better than me, but reading here, it looks as though your operations had some $30-something million budget. I don't know how that's exactly defined, but that in this year's budget battle got cut to $8 million, and a couple of that is spent already, and you've got transparency advocate organizations saying, oh my God, Vivek was in there fighting for transparency, changing the way it works, and now the budget is hacked. It's down to just a fraction of what it was, and we're not going to spend the money to either save them, to realize the savings you were talking about, or achieve that transparency. In a time of tight budgets, are we going to retrench to these old systems and forget the transparency evolution?
Well, I think that will be the biggest mistake, because what we've been able to prove is that by shining light, by building these platforms, by engaging an ecosystem of third parties, that not only is it good government, but it saves billions and billions of dollars. And I'm watching closely as these battles go back and forth.
Did you leave because they cut your budget?
No, absolutely not. It had nothing to do with that.
Why
I think
did you leave?
transparency
Why
is
did you leave? You laid it all out, and who wouldn't like to spend a year on a fellowship at Harvard? But why did you leave?
Well, so when I first came on, I had talked to the president, and I committed to 2 years.
So did Tim Geithner, but he's still there.
And 2.5 years later, one of the things that, as I reflected moving forward, I was coming in at 4:30 in the morning, leaving around 10 p.m., one day after the other, and it was probably the best job I've ever had in my whole life. But I also recognized, that I was moving forward, that it was time to move on.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm happy to take your questions if there are some from the floor. Yes, please. I can't really see, but sing out.
Rich Jaroslavsky from Bloomberg News. I'm wondering about the most visible example of, I guess you'd have to call it, transparency on an historic basis that we've seen in the past year, and that's the WikiLeaks event. And I'm wondering how you view the WikiLeaks disclosures from your standpoint, and how we as digital journalists should view what happened with WikiLeaks.
Great question. Thank you, Rich.
Well, from my perspective, in terms of WikiLeaks, it was classified information that was taken from the government, and it has had very negative implications. So I don't necessarily view this as, it's obviously not an area where I've spent a lot of energy, but it was classified information that was taken from the government. Has had massive negative ramifications to our national security.
Is it inevitable in the digital era that this happens? It's not Daniel Ellsberg hauling around a ton of paper and photocopying it. It's just a disk or less than a disk. Is it inevitable that we'll have this kind of leak?
Well, it's very, very difficult in any ecosystem to try to predict, what one individual will end up doing. I think there are inherent risks. That's why if you look at our national security apparatus, they go through extensive sort of background checks and so forth. But if you look at the WikiLeaks incident, it shouldn't have happened, right, in terms of, from a technology perspective, that there needed to be more controls in place that were just not there.
He just picked up a disk and put it in his pocket,
right.
We're told.
Right, and that's
not
for a classified system, that's unacceptable.
Sounds inevitable at the same time, though. When it's that easy, or maybe just the click of a button, not even a disk.
Well, no, you can engineer systems that would prevent that.
Well, when there's motivation, when there's intent. Questions? Yes?
Thanks. Anthony Moore. I'm with Yahoo. Do you think that the data.gov initiative that you started will survive the next election?
I think that if you look at not just the data.gov initiative, but also If you look at what happened with the White House Secret Service logs that have been released, I think it would be very difficult for someone to make an argument to go back when it comes to transparency. But crazier things have happened in politics. So my view is that it's a one-way street. And I believe that if this community, the more it's used as a platform, the more likely that it won't be terminated.
Have you experienced this as a partisan issue in your work in Washington? Have you found a different texture of reception on one side or the other of the aisle?
It's absolutely not partisan. What I can tell you is in the number of meetings that I've even had with Chairman Issa on the Oversight Committee, that he's been very supportive and helped fight actually for the funding, both on the House side and also on the Senate side. Senator Tom Coburn has been a huge proponent of a more transparent and open government.
I guess I missed the Secret Service logs story. What happened there and how does it pertain?
Well, the president made the decision to make public all the Secret Service logs in terms of visitors who are coming to the White House. And so the idea is it will be fairly awkward for any future administration to come in and say, we're not going to make any of this information available. And they've been used, by the way, to write a number of stories on what's happening within the White House.
Is this vulnerable to issues of security and fear? If we should have another significant terrorist attack, do you think that would raise pressure to reduce transparency, or are these, would you see that as apples and oranges?
I think they're apples and oranges.
Questions? We're just about to wrap here, but happy to have your questions if you've got them. Yes, please.
What is the concern about cloud computing? The U.S. government has some oversight and regulation about this. But in other cases, you're dealing with Google has 10 million servers worldwide, but it falls under the sovereignty of China, of India. Research in Motion had to turn over some privacy codes in India because there were concerns about terrorists using emails, BlackBerry phones. And Google had to deal with censorship issues in China. These U.S. companies no longer fall under just U.S. government regulations. These cloud is now, the information now distributed servers worldwide under a variety of regulations and governments. Is there any sort of efforts going on in order to coordinate, this cloud now out there with computers under all different sovereignties, cooperation with government, and how do you protect this sort of information when it's falling under someone else's rule?
The welter of different regulations and laws in different countries around cloud computing, which is very global.
And that's exactly the point I was making around this focus on data sovereignty. The government's case, just so I'm clear, one of the things that we did is we made sure as these contracts were being signed, whether it was a move to Google or Amazon, that they actually stepped forward and built a .gov solution so that data would reside only in the United States, because a lot of the data sovereignty issues haven't been solved. The other thing we have to
Were they
consider,
responsive to that? Have they been?
Oh, absolutely. So a lot of these vendors, and look, why wouldn't they be? They recognize there's an $80 billion opportunity to fundamentally disrupt what's going on in federal IT.
What about their own access to that information when it's in their server farm, when it's in their cloud?
Well, I
Do we have
think
to worry about Google snooping around or Amazon snooping around in our public data government?
But I think that's the same problem you have right now, which is the majority of the systems are being run by third parties when it comes to federal IT. Mm-hmm. I think the bigger question for us is as we think about cyber warfare, and as nation states build and militarize sort of capabilities on the offense side, and the issues of what privacy means when we talk about information sharing and data.
We're going to wrap in just a second here. You're terrific to be here with the ONA. You've got a kind of vantage on these issues that's really one of a kind in a way. Your parting thoughts to this group. I mean, this is sort of the tip of the spear when it comes to digital news gathering, capacities and attitudes in this country. Your advice to the people in this hall in the last couple of minutes we've got you.
Well, my parting words would be, to form sort of a more perfect republic, that the work that you do is so important, and that whether it's institutions like the United States government or cities and states put out that data, use it, help build this future, and hold your government accountable for how it operates. And also, you're at such an interesting point in history in terms of processing power and storage that's so much cheaper than it's ever been before, that you can deliver information to people that was just structurally impossible before. So take advantage of where you are and the access that you have to a lot of this information.
Advice from the first Chief Information Officer of the United States of America. We may see the monument one day. Vivek Kundra, you're terrific to be here this morning. It's been a great hearing from you and having the advantage of your insight. And I'm sure I am joined by everyone else here in saying thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Tom. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Vivek.
I'd like to thank Tom and Vivek both. For those who are interested, there's a live broadcast of On Point, which will be in the Exeter and Fairfield rooms in about 5 minutes, if I'm not mistaken. Once you're in there, the doors will close. You need to stay there for that hour. It's a live broadcast. And then there will be a second one at 11 o'clock, too, and the same rules apply. So enjoy the conference. Have a wonderful time. We're thrilled that you're here.